Okay, thank you so much, Suzanne. And I'm really glad to be here and talking to you all about a few research projects that I've been engaged in more recently. But I would like to, before we get started, also introduce two of my students who are here today, Diana Farrell and Isaac Onos, and you will be hearing from them also at the end of the presentation during the Q&A session. So both Diana and Isaac have been really integral to these projects, and I couldn't have done it without them. So I'm deeply grateful, and it's been a fun couple of years at least with both of them working on these projects. So you will get a chance to hear from them as well. Today, what I'm going to talk about is two projects, and I'll go through them in sequence. First, talking about Iceland and then Greenland. Before we get to both of those contexts, I wanted to share a slide that you've no doubt seen before, or at least you've heard the context, right? Global temperatures have been increasing over the past few decades, and it is particularly in the Arctic where we're seeing this kind of enhanced warming. So what this map indicates is really, if you look globally, then the temperature anomaly across the Arctic is exacerbated, is enhanced to a greater extent than what you see anywhere else. Now, the two study sites that we're going to look at today, one is Iceland, and you can see the arrow pointing to it, and the other is in South Greenland, and you see that second arrow pointing to it. Both these study sites are, when you look at the comparative perspective of this particular map, they're not necessarily in the deep red zones that you see elsewhere in the Arctic. So while it may not be in those areas where you're seeing very, high temperature increases, they are in areas where their changes are being observed. And so we're going to look at some of these changes that we're observing in these regions. And how are we going to look at them? You know, one of the things that has always been challenging for Arctic studies has been accessibility. It's hard to get up there. It's hard to engage in field research. It's difficult to collect data on a systematic basis year after year after year. And so what I do in my work and my area of specialization is using satellite gathered information to really understand landscape change at a regional and at a local scale. And so one might, ask, well, what is it? What is it that is so special about satellite data? You know, I see them as kind of these remote space-based observatories. They're constantly gathering data about the Earth's surface and a variety of data. It could be data about the actual surface itself. It could be data about our oceans, about the terrestrial world. It could also be data about the atmosphere and how atmospheric conditions are changing. So it's really a wealth of information, and it's looking at the Earth from a very unique perspective. So it's looking from the top and it's looking downward. And so you're getting a perspective that we've never really had before the time of satellites and satellite imaging. And as you'll see in some of the slides later on in this presentation, this unique perspective gives you a really great look at what's going on regionally. These data that we're getting from the satellites that orbit the Earth are not necessarily readily accessible. While one might make one field trip to the Arctic over the summer, perhaps, to gather information, it's not something that you can do year after year or season after season. With the satellites, you can do that. And you have a kind of temporal frequency that's really unmatched. It's unparalleled. And the same for the spatial frequency, because these satellites are collecting data from all across the globe. So not only do you have an expanded spatial and temporal coverage of regions that were at one point in time very difficult to access, but you also have an expanded spectral coverage. So a lot of these satellites are collecting data in the visible part of the spectrum, that part of the spectrum that you and I can see and can understand, but it's also collecting it in the invisible parts of the spectrum to us. So in the near infrared, in the shortwave infrared, in the microwave regions, etc. And it's those regions of the spectrum that really provide an enhanced understanding of what's going on in these areas. And then, of course, finally, we have a long historical archive. And in many cases, the data that satellites have gathered go back into the 1970s. So now when we're in 2021, we're talking about, in some cases, a 45 to 50-year archive of information that is just invaluable to looking at how conditions have changed across the globe. So the satellite analysis that I engage in, I feel, gives me a tremendous view of what's going on in my various study sites. So let's talk first about Iceland. And Iceland's been in the news quite a bit. Someone had mentioned the recent volcanic eruption that's still going on. That's very much down here in the very southern portions, in the Reykjanes Peninsula, which is actually a fairly active, volcanically active zone, and you have this ongoing eruption that might go on for several more months. But the study site that we have looked at over the last couple of years is this ice cap called Hofsjökull. Hofsjökull is an ice cap in the center of the island. It's away from these coastal ice caps, which are very, very much influenced by coastal and oceanic conditions. This one is tucked away, and so it's less influenced by what's going on in these coastal areas. It's also been an ice cap that has not been studied to a very great extent, to the same extent as perhaps Vatna and Eyjafjallajökull and some of these other ice caps. And so we decided to look at it because it was so unique, it was tucked away, had not been studied to a great extent. And we decided to use satellite data because that was the easier way, almost the more efficient way of gathering information from using a kind of long historical archive. And so we use Landsat, which has been NASA's workhorse for decades now, going all the way from Landsat 1 to what we have today, Landsat 8. And Landsat images are in the visible part of the spectrum, but also in the near infrared and in the far infrared bands as well. And Landsat updates almost monthly. So almost every month you would get a new image of the area if you so desired. And so the scale at which we were able to use Landsat data made the most sense for this particular study. Before we get into the data itself, I wanted to give you a feel for this landscape, right? So we're talking about the Arctic, very cold conditions. You can tell from this kind of first image that you see on the top of your screen, which looks at Hofsjökull in the background, this vast, vast ice cap with a lot of moraines that spill out into the surrounding landscape. And you see the surrounding landscape, which is almost looks like desert-like conditions. So with the Arctic, you get very short grasses, mosses, lichens, those sorts of vegetative features. And this is an area that has layers and layers of lava flows, lava sands, etc. So it's a pretty stark landscape in many areas. What you see on the lower graphic or the image is what you would be looking at were you standing on top of Hofsjökull and looking approximately southwest. These are the Kerlingafjall mountains. They're very volcanically active even today. You'll see fumaroles, mudpots, things of that nature. But these are rhyolite mountains, so igneous rock, very, very typical of any volcanically, active zone. Just another view of the same ice cap, and especially if you look at the bottom left image here, this is just a sort of tremendous view of, these outlet glaciers that come off of the actual ice cap itself, and they're tremendously large. They cover a wide expanse, and they fluctuate. So they expand and retreat constantly, over the centuries and millennia. Now, on the bottom right here, you see an area of Arctic wetland, meadow kind of landscape. This is a late season image, and Diana was out there in September and October, and so she was able to gather these photographs. This is an area that we'll talk about a little later on in some more detail as well. So we get to the data itself. So you were looking at a perspective view as you would be standing on the ground and looking out over the ice cap. Here are two Landsat images looking, remember, from out in space down to Earth. And the one thing to understand about these images is they're not necessarily in the visible part of the spectrum, but they're also using a near-infrared band. And the red that you see on the images actually is indicative of vegetation. So anytime you see red, it's indicative of a near-infrared band that's being used. And the red is what we call a false color that we apply so that we can actually see the invisible. In a way, it fools our eyes into seeing something that we otherwise would not be able to see. What you notice is this image on the left is from 1992, and the image on the right is from 2017. So we have about a 25-year time span where we're looking at change across the landscape. And I think if you look at these two images and study them for a while, as we did, you can find a lot of changes. One of the most stark is, of course, the ice cap itself and the changes that are going around, especially on the edges of the ice cap. If you look in particular at this outlet glacier, which is actually a very famous outlet glacier called Hofsjökull, you see that it's shrunk quite a bit over that 25-year time span. And you also notice that the reds seem to be much brighter and vigorous on the right-hand image. And one of the things that we find in our analysis is that vegetation has expanded into areas that was not necessarily in the previous image. So what are the trends that we're seeing, right? How do we really make sense of all of this? In a visual analysis, you can kind of compare and contrast two images and make sense of them visually, qualitatively. We can also do a quantitative analysis of what we were seeing. And we were most interested in what was going on across the ice cap itself, and also what was going on in terms of the vegetation. And so we engage in some sort of quantitative analysis to build classifications. And what these classifications do is essentially lump together data that's similar rather than different. And so you get all of the ice cap that lumps together into one class, all of the vegetation that lumps together into another class, etc. And then what we can do is quantify this change. And one of the things that we observed in this quantification was an increase, a pretty dramatic increase in vegetation across the region. Not across all of the region, but particularly in some areas. Like, for instance, in the sort of south eastern part of the ice cap. And this region here comprises a wetland, an Arctic wetland meadow system called the Thorsaver. And the Thorsaver is pretty famous because it is designated as a wetland of international importance by the Ramsar Convention, which is the International Convention on Wetlands. So one of our thoughts is in our next kind of continuation of this project, we would look at these wetlands in particular to see how they were changing. Are the vegetation assemblages the same as what we see previously? Or are you seeing new and different species coming into this area as perhaps the climate shifts as well? So this gives you a kind of flavor for the kind of analysis that we engage in with the Landsat data. And one of the other pieces of analysis that we did was to look at the ice cap itself and to quantify the change between the earlier which is the 1992 boundary, which you see in the darker shade of gray, versus the 2017 boundary, which is the light gray shade. And what we also did is added an ice and snow boundary that we received from a world institution that collects this kind of data. And what's really interesting is to see the kind of, it's almost like a pulsating shift in the boundary, right? It retreats in times where precipitation perhaps is less or melting is greater. And we see that in 2017. And then it might expand at other moments in time. For instance, in this case here, 1999 boundary is much farther out. So, you know, are the trends linear? No, certainly not. There will be shifts. It will go back and forth. And we will see this, you know, in the decades to come as well. Hofsjökull, over its lifespan of thousands of years, has expanded and contracted many, many times before. And so we will naturally see the same as we move forward. Of course, with enhanced warming, we might see a greater melting of the ice cap itself. And the transects that we created across the ring of the ice cap itself was to measure the retreat, which you can see in this table here. In some cases, the retreat was approximately 8 kilometers from the 1992 boundary. So pretty significant change. So, you know, what do our Iceland study assessments, you know, boil down to? More frequent assessments would give us an enhanced understanding of what was going on with this ice cap. You know, certainly moving forward, the kind of techniques that we use are robust, they're quick to perform, the data is available, and something like this can be done on almost an annual basis to really monitor what's going on with shifts across the Arctic. So this was just kind of a one ice cap, but the entire country of Iceland could do it very easily for all of the ice caps, the major ice caps it has, which are 5 of the large ice caps within the European continent outside of Greenland. And as I had mentioned, the Ramsar Thorsaver is a wetland that we're hoping to engage in some future research. So that was Iceland, and we'll certainly, you know, take any of your questions during the Q&A time period. But I do want to quickly talk about the Greenland study as well that we have engaged in over the last couple of years. So we're flying, you know, about 800 kilometers or so westward from Iceland into South Greenland in particular. And it's this small little portion here that has zoomed into, so you get a sense for the fjord kind of landscape that you're seeing. The ice cap, the edges of the ice cap almost come all the way down to the ocean. These fjords are, you know, they have been relatively ice-free, permafrost-free for some time now. And of course, this region of South Greenland is very famous, and it's famous because, as someone mentioned earlier, this is where Leif Erikson had landed in South Greenland, came over from Iceland, set up settlements in South Greenland, and these settlements lasted for about 300 to 400 years. This was during the kind of medieval warm period, so about 900, 930 AD to, you know, roughly into the late 1300s or so. So you had these flourishing settlements of Norse Vikings that came over and settled in several communities across South Greenland, and then a little farther up the coast as well, where Nuuk, the capital of Greenland, is located. But then they vanished, and they vanished in the late 1300s. By the 1400s, there was no record of people that were still living there. And it's always been kind of this big mystery, right, in the scientific community. And of course, we do have several hypotheses now that suggest that the climate cooled very suddenly. And it cooled because of the Little Ice Age that came along after the medieval warm period. And perhaps that cooling was enough to not allow for farming to flourish in this region. And so the people that lived here cut off from Europe, perhaps because of ice, sea ice, etc., and unable to grow enough food and resources for themselves, perished, were not able to adapt to those changing conditions. So we go back, several centuries later and try to understand what's going on in South Greenland today. And here's a map of the region and a lot of the old Norse settlement sites that you can see highlighted on this map. There are still remnants, archaeological sites from these old Norse settlements. This is a very famous Valdsay church that you can go up to, walk inside and around. Impressive stone structure from several hundreds of years ago. Other archaeological sites are farms that they have unearthed in Igaliku in South Greenland. And these farms actually exist side by side with current day farming communities. So once again, this area, which had been a very agriculturally rich area way back during the medieval period, when the Norse Vikings settled in this region, are once again fairly active agricultural regions over the last 20th century and into the 21st century. So what were we looking at? We were using a different satellite data set, also NASA satellite called MODIS, Moderate Resolution Radiometer. And we used MODIS to understand seasonal and decadal shifts in vegetation cover at this site in South Greenland, which is now a designated UNESCO World Heritage site called Kujataa. So we wanted to look at these shifts, and we wanted to map out the spatial variability and the temporal variability and monitor these coastal fjords and how things were changing, whether it was greening because of enhanced warming in the Arctic, or as some other studies across the Arctic have found, that areas are browning. So quote unquote browning in the sense that even higher temperatures do not necessarily result in more vegetation, perhaps because of the lack of water resources, or perhaps the soil, not the ideal conditions for growing, etc. So we wanted to look at that for the region itself and also understand a little bit about how humans are influenced by landscape change. So once again, to look at some quick, very, very quick images. As you fly into South Greenland, you can see the expanse of the Greenlandic ice cap towards the north as you're flying, sort of westward, and it is immense. Don't see the horizon, it's just sort of goes on. When you get to South Greenland, to that fjord landscape that I had shown you in previous maps, you see lots of outlet glaciers. You can, sort of go by boat all the way up to the glacier itself, and you see a sort of subarctic landscape, almost a subarctic landscape, because the conditions are relatively warm for the Arctic, especially during the summer months. The landscape varies a lot in areas where precipitation conditions, soil conditions, and climate conditions may not necessarily allow for tree cover. You have these short grasses, short stunted willows, etc., that will grow. This area is very close to the edge of the ice cap, which might be just about a half kilometer, further towards the north. And yet, you have fairly robust vegetation. Vegetation springs up on almost every nook and cranny, on cliff sides, etc., wherever there's a foothold for roots to get traction. And you also find in the particularly sheltered areas of the fjords, of the upland fjords and the mid fjords, you can find, birches, willow trees that grow to fairly significant heights. So you have this kind of mixed landscape. And then, of course, you have the meadows of the lower fjords and the really sheltered fjords where agriculture takes place today, and it has in the past as well. It's primarily sheep farming that is engaged in most of these fjord communities and farms that are spread out across the Kujataa region. So as I said, we looked at MODIS, which is a moderate resolution. Landsat, is much higher in spatial resolution. So you can see a lot more detail on the images for Landsat. It is 30 meters in spatial resolution as opposed to 250 meters. So each little pixel that you see on an image is 250 meters by 250 meters. So it's relatively coarse, but we were not necessarily interested in very much detail. We wanted a regional scale analysis, and so MODIS was perfect. MODIS also creates a greenness or vegetation index for us, which is very useful. It gives us a little sense of vegetation across the landscape and a little bit about its vigor. How vigorous is it? Is it in peak growing condition? Is it senescing, etc.? And MODIS gives us these 16-day average data sets. So we collected them for May through September, May as the early season, July as peak season, and September as late season data sets, all the way from 2000 to 2020, so a 20-year period. And MODIS is only available since 2000. We had over 60 image data sets, and both Isaac and Diana did an absolutely amazing job going through them and distilling the information from them. Now, in the backdrop of this vegetation change, if we just look at the temperature anomaly over the long term, right? So let's say we are looking at the long-term mean from 81 to 2010, which is the center line where it says 0. And then you look at how has temperature shifted across the region. This is from 1951 all the way to the present day. And over here, I just kind of zoom in to the most recent 2 decades of the study. The blue line is November through March average temperatures, and the red line is May through September average temperatures. And the one thing that's pretty distinct is for the most part, the last 2 decades, we have seen above the long-term average for the region, with of course a few years where it has been somewhat below the average. But for the most part, it has been above average. And there are particular years where you'll see conditions are really look stark, very different, because there was a peak in temperature, and that was particularly the 2010 time period. So keeping that at the back of your mind, let's look at some of the data that we've been able to distill. This is the same region of South Greenland, and you can kind of see the fjords here. This is May, July, and September from 2000, right? And very typical pattern. In May, there's very little of the vegetation that's come up. Remember, Arctic, subarctic, so it takes some time. July, peak vegetation. Yes, things are looking pretty green, especially in the lower fjords, perhaps not so much closer to the ice cap. And by September, you can see the vigor has decreased. Vegetation is starting to senesce and starting to sort of, die back for the winter months. So that's 2000. Here's 2010. Remember I said it was that anomalous year? Particularly for May, much different from the earlier 2000 image, right? You see the same, July and then September. So 2010 was a unique year. And then let's look at 2020, which perhaps is more sort of what you would expect. Once again, the May image is really quite distinctive from that early 2000 image. There is a lot more vegetation that comes up sooner, it almost seems like. You have the same kind of vigor in July, and we'll look a little later on to see that the September images also, data from more recent September images is showing that things are changing, even in the late season. So what our students, Isaac and Diana, did is pick 12 different locations across the study site to really map out how this greenness index, or the NDVI as we call it, is shifting over time. And we found some interesting sort of results from this data. So remember, it's only 12 locations across this vast study site. So a very limited amount of data, but there's a very distinct trend. The May data shows an increase over the 20-year period, quite distinctly. September data is almost the same. You don't see very much sort of long-term average change. And the July data is almost, very, very similar as well. And this makes sense, right? This is the greenness index. May, less green, July, deep green, and September, once again, less green because of the senescing vegetation. So this told us that something's going on in that early season that's important to pay attention to. So we started looking at the data in different ways. And one way is to look at that seasonality. And so we sort of looked at the data side by side just for, let's say, early season in May. And I'm just showing you 3 of the data sets, right? Just the decadal differences. But we're doing this for every year right through the 2 decades. And we look at July, and there are some differences. And then we look at September, and you see some differences over the decades as well. How do we make sense of this, right? What we can do is take 2 time periods and minus 1 time period from another, so that you're only looking at the change areas. And we did this to give us this result. Now let's just take a while to understand what this data set is telling us. This is just looking at 2 decades of change from 2000 to 2020. So we're only looking at those 2 time periods. In May, you have less attention to the colors, but more attention to what the colors are telling us. So for instance, in the May data set, there are lots of reds. And what the reds indicate is greater greenness in 2020 versus 2000, right? So there's more greening going on in this region in recent decades as opposed to the past. For the July image, you notice there's not a great deal of change. You don't see the same as what you're seeing in May. You do see areas of change, particularly along the ice cap itself. So that's an interesting spatial trend. Is the ice cap retreating, and that's where green vegetation is taking a hold? Perhaps. We still have to delve into that to a greater extent. Is the ice cap is the vegetation also coming up on those really highland regions? Like for instance, this little red splotch here, that's a highland region. Perhaps not a lot of vegetation when it was really cold. If conditions are right, vegetation, would sort of start showing up there. And then in the late season change, what we're seeing is that the lower fjords seem to sort of, be very, very similar. It's the upper fjords that perhaps are changing much more rapidly, and you're seeing greenness in those upper fjord regions as opposed to the earlier time period. So we're still teasing out these differences, and what we'll do is now look at it at a finer scale every 5 years as opposed to every 10 years to really understand what's going on. But hopefully this gives you a flavor for how we look at these data sets and really make sense of how things are changing in this part of the Arctic. So the next steps are to complete this analysis, to publish the results with Isaac and Diana, and really to hopefully next year, when we are back in the field in Greenland, in South Greenland, to engage in more sort of detailed vegetation analysis and focus on the farming and agricultural trends across the region. How is agriculture changing? How is farming changing? This region, what we've observed from talking to the farmers there is that it's becoming drier during the summer months, and that's not great for agriculture because hay production is reduced because of less rainfall. And if hay production is reduced, then the sheep have less to eat. and especially also over the winter months. And so that is not good news for some of the sheep farms. So these shifts that we're seeing is not only temperature-wise, but we also focus on precipitation trends. And it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out in the next few years. So just to kind of wrap up very rapidly so that you have time for questions as well. You know, I have worked in this field for the last 2+ decades. Most of my research, if not all of it, engages in satellite data analysis. I find it to be an enormously powerful tool. It really has revolutionized how we understand the Earth and its systems, and especially change. And one of the things I always try to do is understand the changing conditions, both from the natural perspective, so perhaps naturally occurring changes, but also how humans have influenced that change. So how have humans influenced the landscape, and then how does that change affect them in turn? And we'll particularly be looking at South Greenland and how landscape change there is affecting these agricultural communities. So how this helps those communities, I think, is monitoring the changes, both the spatial monitoring of the change and the temporal monitoring will help them understand, perhaps anticipate the change that's coming, and maybe prepare for future conditions, perhaps prepare them to engage this change, understand it, reduce their risk, build their resilience to that change, and enable them to sort of successfully live in this region for the long term. So I hope that was a quick introduction to some of the work. But before we wrap up and open it up to questions, I wanted you to look at this. I don't know if it will work, but let me try. This is in South Greenland in June of 2019. We were visiting there, a faculty group from the University of Maine system, and we saw numerous of these outlet glaciers where the water is just gushing out off the ice cap. And after we returned, we realized that the summer of 2019 was where we saw enhanced warming. And they said the discharge from the ice cap was the greatest on record up until then. So it was a pretty significant year for melting in the region. But I will stop it there and stop sharing my screen. And thank you for listening. And I would like to call on both Diana and Isaac to also share in the Q&A session. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Firooza. It's really interesting. I don't see any questions in the chat box yet, but feel free to type them in there. And if you're not comfortable with that method of asking questions, you can unmute yourself and ask that way. There's a few of us here that will work as well. I'll get us started, and I'm curious, when you look at how this landscape change is affecting the communities, what will your method be? Are you planning to interview the communities, or what will your interactions be with them, do you think?
Yes, so it primarily will be interviewing and perhaps some survey work. So we hope to do that next summer when we're back in South Greenland. When we were there in 2019, we did engage with a lot of the farming, the folks who had farms, large farms across the region. And we spoke to them, but it was mostly anecdotal information. We weren't really engaging in a systematic study. So it will be interesting to go back and talk to them and see even how the last couple of years have shifted in terms of what they're seeing. They definitely noticed changes in the last decade or so in terms of their farm output and whatnot. I think there's a question about the Icelandic ice cap, and Diana will correct me, but I believe it is Hofsjökull.
That's pretty good.
Yeah, I was really impressed with your pronunciation of all those names. Did you have to take a course, or what was learning like?
Well, it's, yeah, what an interesting language, and the words are much longer than what we're typically used to in English. But you sort of pick it up when you understand what words have what kind of pronunciation. You just sort of pick it up over time, I think. I don't know Icelandic, unfortunately. You know, I would like to have perhaps Diana and Isaac talk a little bit about their experience on the project. Maybe Isaac, do you want to share kind of the work that you did and what you learned?
Yeah, absolutely. Hello, everyone. It is kind of strange to be talking about the Arctic on one of the nicest nights of the year outside, but I am the newest member to the team. I wasn't a part of the Iceland study, but I have been working on the Greenland side of things pretty much since late August, early September of 2020. And a lot of what I've been doing is, alongside Diana as well, is some of those maps that you saw later on. We took some satellite data, the MODIS data of the Kujataa region of Greenland, and Diana and I divvied up the work. It takes a tremendous amount of time to work with the data, and tried to figure out the way to best to present it. And I also kind of those maps towards the end where you saw the red versus the blue to see, you know, if there's been a bigger change in 2020 versus 2000. That was a part of the project that I spent a lot of time on. But yeah, it's been a ton of fun, and I hope if there's a chance next summer to be able to go and see it in person.
Good evening, everyone. My name's Diana. I worked with Firooza on the Iceland project with Hofsjökull. That was really, I learned a lot from that project on just how to use the Landsat data and to do the analysis and to create the classified images that you saw using the near infrared, and just how much information you can get from outside the visible part of the spectrum. Like Firooza mentioned, that was really eye-opening, and I loved being able to go to Iceland. I was fortunate enough to be able to go there twice, and I highly recommend it. It's a very beautiful place. So it was also equally rewarding to be able to go to the actual locations that we were studying and to get those photographs and be able to verify the analysis that we had done with the Landsat imagery. So that was really great. And for the Greenland project, working with the MODIS data, so learning to work with a new type of satellite imagery, a new sensor, and all that it can do, because it's amazing to see how the different types of data that you can get from all these different sensors, and there's so many. So there's really so many different types of analysis you can do, and so it is a very powerful tool, and it was fun to get to work with different data sets. That was really rewarding.
I'll also add really quickly that
Thank you, Isaac and Diana. It's great to hear your perspective as well.
Sure.
Go ahead, Isaac. I think you were about to.
Yeah, I was just going to say, you know, this sort of vegetation study is somewhat common in remote sensing, including the Arctic region. However, this is kind of the first study of its type in southern Greenland, which is really exciting to to kind of be, to pushing the rock a little bit more forward, using remote sensors for a part of the world that is a UNESCO World Heritage site and has a lot of other interesting things going on in regards to increase in tourism and mining and all things like that. So it's really important work.
This is Roy Smoot in June here in Kennebunk. I'm not sure who the question's for of the three of you, but Dr. Pavri, you're from the School of Public Service, the Muskie School. What's the ultimate, two questions. What's the ultimate purpose of your studies? What are you trying to show? And then also based on your being in Greenland and Iceland, how is this affecting the people that live there?
I was wondering that too.
Yeah, those are great questions. So, as a professional geographer, one of the things that I do as in addition to my teaching, which is what I do primarily at the University of Southern Maine, I also engage in research. And so this is very much part of my research portfolio. And the kind of analysis that we're doing, as Isaac mentioned, the vegetation study that we're doing in that particular part of South Greenland hasn't been done before. So what we're always trying to do is push the envelope in terms of doing something that might be new, that might not have been done before. And by doing that, we're contributing to the larger literature of, and the larger understanding of how climate is influencing different parts of the world. And the Arctic has been, a particular focus of study because the changes have been so rapid in the Arctic, and they are so amplified, so much more amplified in the Arctic than in other parts of the globe, that all of a sudden scientists have really sort of paid attention to what's going on there. So I would say the goals are, manifold. One is to teach the kind of technology that we use to our students, because this is really cutting edge technology that will enable them hopefully to move on with their own professional careers. Two is to kind of contribute to the research and the scientific community, our understanding of what's going on. And three, I would say, is also to try out new techniques, to use new techniques to understand these data sets in greater detail, to kind of draw out some of their inherent information, to draw it out and to be able to explain it to an audience, to the public, to be able to share this information with the public. So I think all of that combined. And your second question was about the people in South Greenland. My hope would be that when we go back next year, we will be able to share some of this information with them so that they can see their own landscape and see how it has changed over time. The other thing we do is also publish the results of any study. And so, for instance, the Iceland study has already been published in a journal. Diana and I co-authored that study. And what we're working on now is another publication with Isaac and Diana on the South Greenland work. So that is the other hope, is that then you get to share that information with other scientists who might be interested in looking at what we've been able to do. I hope that answers.
I have actually one comment to add to that, Firooza. The Kujataa was the primary reason it was nominated as a World Heritage Site is because of its outstanding example of a traditional human settlement and the unique farming. It's a blend of Norse and Inuit farming and the sheep farming. So this subsistence farming really, it's one of the reasons it was nominated was because it's very vulnerable to irreversible change due to the changes in climate. So by the work that we're doing and by publishing and sharing it with other scientists, it's helping this area that is really kind of vulnerable right now.
I see there's another message in the chat, and it says, my husband is a geologist and birder, so he's watching the Icelandic volcano live daily and is interested if the world-class wetlands south of your icecap study is a haven for wildlife specifically. Yes, that wetland, the Thorsaver, the Ramsar site, is actually very, very well known for nesting birds. And migratory species from Europe and I believe even as far south as Africa come over during the summer months to nest there. It's far enough away from the current volcanic eruption that I don't believe it is going to have any impact on the wetland itself. And the current volcanic eruption is I would say smaller by Icelandic comparisons of previous eruptions. So.
Apologies, my internet went out. I'm so glad you're still here, but it bumped me off my own Zoom meeting. So apologies, sorry you had to monitor the chat without me there.
No problem. Yes, there were lots of interesting questions, so no problem at all.
I guess
see.
I guess
Yeah,
I
go ahead.
also is since your research has been going on, are there other areas in the world, say on the similar latitude, that will be benefiting from your research, or is there maybe research going on somewhere else that you all can share back and forth?
Yes, I think in a nutshell, yeah, I would say yes, absolutely. And I'd like Diana and Isaac to tackle that question, but absolutely. So we always, when we're doing a study site, kind of a case study, which both of these are case studies of these particular locations, my thought is always to see how it can be used elsewhere. How can the techniques be used elsewhere? How can the data be used elsewhere to understand changes across the region? And these techniques are universal, so you could use them whether you were studying the Arctic or whether you were studying an equatorial region as well. So there is a comparability. There's a broader aspect to our work, which is that it can be used to really understand similar situations elsewhere. And I don't know if Diana and Isaac have additional thoughts on that.
Yeah. So much of this type of research is trying to think of other parts of the world that are similar. And that is something on the back of our mind is, what can be learned from here? Greenland is interesting compared to other parts of the Arctic because it doesn't seem to be as well studied, at least on the vegetation side of things. So some of the early steps that we were doing is reading studies, one, just to see what is being done in this type of work, but also to see where it is being done. And so one idea is these, like we picked 12 pins in the area. That was largely inspired by a study that was done in Alaska, in which they picked certain points in a region to see if there's vegetation change to compare both to what the satellite is seeing and what is actually happening in the field. And as Dr. Pavri had mentioned, that is one of the goals later on in this, is to potentially have some sort of field study component to it. But yeah, there's loads of other things related to that. And the Arctic as a whole is a fascinating place, and what you do in Greenland can totally apply to other areas.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'd just like to add to that, in the beginning of any kind of study, we do a literature review. So we do a canvassing of the literature that's out there as much as we can find that's relevant to the type of study that we're doing. So as Isaac mentioned, we looked at what scientists were doing in Alaska or in other regions and what type of data did they use. And we try to learn from from what they've done, and then we added our own piece to it and built on that. And so ultimately, hopefully someone else will see what we've done and build on that. So we do all definitely, the data is, it goes to a lot of places and to a lot of people, a lot of researchers. And one other comment that I just popped into my head is, like, for example, the MODIS data. Now, we use the NDVI, which is a vegetation index that was suitable for our area. But there is another data set that's called the EVI, the Enhanced Vegetation Index, that is more suitable for tropical regions, for high moisture areas. So this process, we could just take another data set and kind of take what we're doing and apply it to even a completely different climate. So the skills are transferable.
Does anyone else have questions? All right. Well, goodness, Diana, Isaac, and Firooza, thank you so much. So interesting. Thank you for doing this research and sharing it with all of us, and best of luck on your summer of 2022 in person in the field.
Yes, thank you so much, Suzanne. This was a lot of fun for us. We always enjoy sharing our work with others.